the point I made in my latest post was that essentially protein is king. Just to speak on a few points, you've mentioned there that the protein intake in the average American is about 15%, which is abysmally low, and vast majority of their protein actually comes from plant-based protein, which, as we know, is incomplete. Protein's king, and we've got these two fuel sources in fat and carbohydrate. It is just so much easier to consume fatty proteins because they're not mixing fuels. It's a sense of convenience. Additionally, fat is an essential macronutrient, as we know. It can be very vitamin rich. So where I think it can be lost in translation, especially in some of the ketogenic circles, where this overconsumption of fat occurs with the intention to stabilize blood sugars. I think that is, and we've seen that in clinical practice, and we work very closely with dietitians. Fundamentally, that is a lost cause, because yes, in someone with very, very good muscle quality, I guess that's going to soak up a lot of that fat-based fuel, and it all comes down to muscle-based quality. But in someone with very poor muscle quality or is sarcopenic, I think that might be problematic, because that fat has to accumulate. It has to go somewhere. If I tend to think of muscle as a sponge, and if you've got a saturated sponge, well, it has to store, and I think visceral fat is where it accumulates.
We saw, I think, with the ketogenic diet, people saw differences in satiety. We can talk about, the relative value of satiety. It's nice to say you're going to eat less calories, but how do you get there if you're hungry all the time? It doesn't work. So you find a satiating food. And then we had this period of time where people were just pounding in, all this basically concentrated artificial fats.
I think processed fat, in the sense of liquid calories from oil or butter and things, these sort of things are very, very easy to overeat, because there's no satiety aspect associated with it. And that's the same with the fat bombs in some of these low carbohydrate groups. Whereas animal fat, in association with protein, is very difficult to overeat, because there's consistency to it. You have to bite through it. You've got to chew through it. There's many aspects to it. Processed protein in whey powders and so forth, I tend to see a lot of, as patients, a lot of personal trainers and bodybuilders with a lot of gut-based symptoms. And I think people fail to take into consideration that you will overwhelm the capacity of the small bowel to absorb this protein. Sometimes, if it's in this sort of liquid form, that protein ends up in the colon putrefying, and you sort of select for a very putrefactive type microbiome, which then you've got the issues with these nitrogen and hydrogen and methane and all these sort of gases being liberated from these microorganisms. So yes, protein can be overdone, and often overdone when it's in this sort of protein powdered format. I've never been supportive of it. I think if you're an elderly person trying to get in protein and you've got to suffer with poor dentition and so forth, yes, perhaps it's not a bad idea to introduce whey-based protein to it. We as humans, the amount of fuel that we're supposed to extract from short-chain fatty acids fermented in our gut from things like non-absorbable carbohydrates and fiber is only 5 to 7%. Right. And so where does the rest of the 93 to 95% of the fuel come from? I think, and this is part of the issue with this food pyramid, it's pushed fiber almost as a nutrient source, when it clearly isn't. It's simply a substrate for bacteria, and the bacteria benefit from that. They ferment this fiber and extract these short chain fatty acids, but the kicker is that they utilize most of it and give us a little bit. So it's a partial bargain with the microbiome when it comes to fiber. And so from a perspective of the human gut, we very, very quickly overwhelm our ability to hold this gas in very good, with excessive levels of fiber. And this is the issue. A lot of people get very, very uncomfortable with excessive fiber consumption because of all these issues being carried in the bulk and the fermentation that goes with it. With regards to butyrate generated on a zero fiber diet, I think very quickly you can tap into your own fat stores and pull beta hydroxybutyrate, which is a far more efficient molecule to and you nourish your colon systemically through the blood supply rather than locally by fermenting it within the cecum. You know, this is why a lot of people on very low fiber diets, actually a lot of their bowel issues alleviated as long as they're getting the right macronutrient ratio to ensure that their beta hydroxybutyrate levels are elevated. Now, on a high protein diet, because of the fact that you're relatively calorie restricted due to the satiety factors, you are going to be tapping into your fat stores at many points during the day. Methane is a potent mediator in slowing gut motility, and people forget from the mouth to the anal canal, it's fundamentally a 6 meter long tube. There's various offshoots and so forth, but the thing is one long tube, and if there is significant amounts of methane in the hind gut being generated in the hind gut, the entire gut slows down, including esophageal contractions, which is fascinating, right? And so a lot of gastroesophageal reflux can actually be mediated downstream in the colon. There have been a lot of studies that have shown this, quite elegant studies as well, so where they've infused basal methane into the colon via an external tube and then noted that esophageal motility slows down. So I think methane is an issue, because if you've over time selected for methogenic bacteria, right, in your hind gut, and you're predisposed to then creating excess amounts of methane from fermenting carbohydrates and other fibers and not starchy type of foods, you're essentially going to end up with issues related to gut motility, and gut motility is something that's kind of under looked at, because we look at reflux as acid-based disease, but really at its core, I think it's a motility-based disease related to muscle. Yesterday, I was doing a colonoscopy list, and I turned around and said to the nursing staff when we got around to the right side of the colon on a patient whose preparation wasn't ideal, I said, do you see all this plant material? There was nuts, there was seeds, there were leaves. I asked them, do you see any beef or do you see any meat in here? And the answer is, you never see that, okay? But the reason for that is because we, as humans, we're autoenzyme digesters. We have this concept that meat rots in the gut, but that's very, very far from reality. We use stomach acid firstly to cleave meat into smaller portions to expose protein absorbing areas, and then we utilize the brush border and enzymes in the small gut to actually break it down very, very efficiently. So the interesting thing is very little animal sourced foods actually makes it into the colon. So it's interesting to me that a lot of people in the plant-based community suggest that red meat rots in the gut and causes cancer. The mechanism is very, very far from that.
Here's a diagram of the small gut villus structure showing the brush border.
I think if we had a step back, Sean, there is no doubt that what is correlated with colorectal cancer is actually obesity and metabolic syndrome. So really the diet that allows you to be metabolically healthy and metabolically flexible is very unlikely to be associated with colorectal cancer. You've made the point about the weak epidemiology that we've got linking it, and I don't need to revisit that because I think that's well known now that these were really founded on basic epidemiological studies which have significant flaws, you know, it was a really poor quality statement by the World Health Organization, and hopefully something that we can readdress. But for the moment, it is still pushed out as by our health bodies that red meat is a risk factor for cancer and that it increases risk by 18%. Yet we know that the World Health Organization, when they looked at these studies, that 18% was for processed meat. Now, somehow that's been extrapolated to also include red meat in general. So really, they haven't separated from processed meats, which tend to be found in burgers and pizzas and so forth. And you know, they haven't been able to separate it from good quality meat, which is what most in this community tend to eat. So, but to sort of end this point, Sean, it would be, well, how can a diet that makes you metabolically healthy increase your risk of colorectal cancer, right? It just simply doesn't make sense from a logical perspective. With regards to TMAO and the heterocyclic amines and so forth, I think again we're overcomplicating things. I mean, we've utilized fire for 2 million years, 1.8 million years. And we've always cooked our meat, and in fact that whole concept of cooking was critical to our brain development because it allowed these nutrients to be accessed easier. It was a critical part of our evolutionary history, so I think we're overcomplicating it.
TMAO, trimethylene N oxide, is produced by gut bacteria from choline, lecithin, and L-carnitine from fish, meat, egg, and dairy.
The human body is very, very capable of dealing with a lot of these compounds, especially with a gut that is extremely permeable. So I think we have to simplify the approach. I would say that the evidence that shows red meat causes cancer is extremely problematic, flawed, and it needs to be questioned. I think gut dysbiosis is the key to modern illness. And it's kind of this vicious cycle that we enter into. The issue at the moment is that we've got a huge proportion of the population on proton pump inhibitors, and I worry about how this might all start actually within the stomach. In addition, we're consuming foods that are essentially poor quality, processed, and have to end up in the colon fermenting.
Gut dysbiosis, the overgrowth of some bacteria or yeasts in the gut, the absence or insufficiency of beneficial bacteria, low diversity of species in the microbiome, proton pump inhibitors, medications whose main action is a profound and prolonged reduction of stomach acid production.
So a lot of the times, just by virtue of the way we're eating, very low percentage of animal sourced foods, essentially bypassing the small bowel and utilizing the colon a lot, I think we're just selecting in our hind gut for a lot of strange species of bacteria, which I don't think the human gut is particularly adapted to. Plant-based protein, interestingly, is more prone to putrefactive digestion because of the anti-nutrients within these plant-based proteins. That's found in soy and a variety of other plant proteins like maize and a lot of these cereal-based compounds. So it kind of speaks to the point that the more reliant a nation is on plant-based protein, interestingly, the higher their rates of stunting, the higher their rates of diabetes and so forth, because fundamentally these proteins are not well absorbed, hence cannot be incorporated into muscle and bone like we need them to. I think the latest data that I've looked at, some of the more scientific-based studies that is looking at mechanistic basis for diverticulosis, it seems to suggest that a lot of it is increased intracolonic pressure, which is very interesting to me because increased intracolonic pressure can only come from in the setting of excessive plant-based consumption, really, because you're essentially increasing stool bulk through all this fiber, whether it be soluble or insoluble. In addition, a lot of it's to do with gas, colonic gas, and that's a very prevalent problem, I think, in this modern world.
Diverticulosis, when pockets called diverticula form in the walls of your digestive tract, inner layer of intestine pushes through the weak spots, bulging into outer layer, making little pouches. This most often happens in the colon.
I think we're utilizing the colon excessively, whereas as a species, we are mid-gut absorbers. We are built with a very, very acidic stomach, and we use our mid-gut for absorption. Yet, paradoxically, we're using our hindgut. And we cannot do that efficiently. Anatomically, we are definitely we definitely disadvantaged from that perspective. But then, on the flip side, that's what helped us build our brain. And so we've got this paradox there. So with regards to diverticulosis, that's an absolute pandemic. I mean, just in my career as a gastroenterologist over this last 10 years, we're seeing it in younger and younger and younger patients. And to be honest, the vast majority of colonoscopies that I do, I see diverticulosis. Is fiber protective in diverticulosis? The data is very, very scant there. And a lot of that is, I think, just mantra that's been repeated over the years. I see diverticulosis in people that are on extremely high fiber diets. And interestingly, some of it tends to be worse in those groups. So I think it goes back to potentially overuse of the large bowel. In addition, an element of energy starvation of the large bowel. Obviously, there's some genetic factors as well associated with it. In the last few years of practice, probably been my happiest because I feel like I'm implementing changes that help people on a very fundamental level. The issue is, Sean, the vast majority of people won't take on the advice. It's very interesting to see that. We find that the older the person, this is a generalization, the older the person, the less able they are to be malleable or flexible about these changes. In addition, a lot of what we speak is so anti-establishment, I guess, the best way I can put it, that I find it very, very difficult to implement change in some of these people. We're essentially going against a food pyramid that they've been indoctrinated with for many decades, and still seeing headlines coming out talking about the dangers of red meat and the dangers of animal-sourced food, which confuses people fundamentally. But the way I've been able to do it in my practice, Sean, I work with 4 brilliant dietitians now. They're all low carbohydrate dietitians. We talk a lot about personalized nutrition, right? To these patients, we don't put a label on the diet, but worked into that paradigm is the fact that we prioritize protein for these people, in particular quality protein, which is animal source. So we maximize protein, and then we teach people that fat actually is an essential macronutrient. And we work into their mind that potentially carbohydrates are non-essential, and so we personalize these diets for people. We are very we see a diverse range of people from people that are extremely fit and personal trainers to those that potentially coming from a vegetarian spectrum. But we try and make it work, and it's not always easy. And I think the multidisciplinary team approach has been the best approach. I'd love to work in the future potentially with an exercise physiologist and groups of trainers and so forth, but I think that's for the future. But to answer your question, Sean, I'm probably happiest practicing this way as opposed to the times I was writing scripts to treat people's reflux with anti-acid drugs.
The exercise physiologists or the people that are going to get people exercising, I think this is something that I think a lot of people, it gets lost in these diet wars, that regardless of what nutritional plan you get on, you need to be doing resistance training, in my view. I mean, this is what's going to give you preserve lean muscle mass regardless of anything else, because you can look at proponents of any diet, and the ones that work out are going to have more muscle mass. You know, it may be, one may facilitate it more than others, but that has to be part of the equation, in my view.
It's been phenomenal to see, and I have put on muscle. I mean, you can't help but put on muscle with a diet that's rich in quality protein. In addition, what it's allowed me to do, Sean, is I have a desire to move. Do you know what I mean? I've got a desire to get out there and exercise. I've just got endless energy. Whereas I think if you're affected with poor energy because you're eating heavily processed crap all day, it's just very difficult to motivate yourself to get out there and exercise. You know, our body is built for movement, and I've come to appreciate this on a diet that prioritizes protein the way we do. So, yeah, it's an interesting one, Sean. I think the first step to getting off the proton pump inhibitors, proton pump inhibitors don't treat the reflux. They basically reduce the acidity of the refluxate. You're still reflux. It's not as acidic, hence not as irritating. It doesn't fix the fundamental problem, which is an issue related to motility and also diaphragmatic weakness, which then leads to things like hydersemia. The diaphragm is this really important muscle that pinches around your stomach and maintains it. But we've got this diaphragmatic sarcopenia in the modern world, that second valve that pinches around the stomach's lost. So I think the key step is to get off the proton pump inhibitors. It's actually not that difficult to do. I think once you start dropping a little bit of visceral fat and reducing the foods that ferment, the reflux actually improves relatively quickly. So once the proton pump inhibition is stopped, once the channel blockade is stopped from that drug, the acid secretion does improve. But you're absolutely spot on with regards to acid production reducing in the elderly. That's unfortunately an inevitable process of aging. With regards to the hydrochloric acid supplements, the data is very mixed on it. Sean, I personally haven't used it. I do my best to get people off proton pump inhibition. I've found that to be sufficient for most. With regards to pancreatic supplementation, there's a lot of data for that. If you've got pancreatic insufficiencies, I think the lipases are very, very efficient. You can have pancreatic insufficiency in a variety of disease states. It can be easily measured. I think some people are utilizing these pancreatic lipases without indication. But you can do a fecal test to check if you've got pancreatic malabsorption, and it generally happens in disease states where the pancreas is compromised. Usually we see it in people that have consumed a lot of alcohol over the years. I look at aging as essentially oxidative stress over the years. We are all prone to oxidative stress, and we must inevitably age. We can't live forever, but you're absolutely right. Like if you're on a diet and on an exercise regime that minimizes oxidative stress, and we can measure this, things like high sensitivity CRPs, LDL subfractions to see if your LDL is an oxidated particle. We tend to see people on these low carbohydrate, high protein, moderate fat diets tend to have very little oxidative stress. Most of them, right? It's very reduced levels of oxidative stress. So if you're not generating these free radicals, then you're preserving a lot of these cells a lot better, whether that's gastric acid producing cells or your colonocytes. I think it's like anything else. If you're utilizing your stomach acid and there's a reduction of these reactive oxidation species, you're going to preserve it a lot longer. Inflammatory bowel disease is fascinating, Sean. Personal experience that I've been seeing is with mild to moderate ulcerative colitis, the response to lifestyle change can be quite rapid, actually. But again, the patient has to be motivated and willing to take on the diet. We tend to start with and the dietitians do this within our practice. We start with an exclusion protocol, which eliminates a lot of high toxicity foods, in particular high toxicity vegetables, from the diet. We essentially strip it down to bare essentials, which is fundamentally quality animal protein. In some people, we found that eggs can be immunogenic, and we tend to do these food print tests, which look at the levels of immunoglobulin in the serum. I'm not sure how valid they are, but we found it useful. Additionally, we found dairy can be an immunogenic trigger for some. So we tend to eliminate these foods and just strip it down to bare basics and then add back in foods. So I don't think people necessarily need to be, and we've seen this in clinical practice, that strictly meat-based, but it's about repairing the gut, repairing the colon, and then adding in low toxicity fruits and vegetables for sanitary reasons. I think like it's up to the individual, but some simply can't pull off from a long-term adherent perspective a 100% meat-based diet forever. So that's been my experience. Crohn's disease, I suspect, is much more complex. The dietary approach to Crohn's disease has been variable. Perhaps that's related to compliance as well. With regards to very, very severe inflammatory bowel disease, Sean, I've got to be careful instituting diet just from a regulatory standpoint. So we tend to offer them medical-based management first, but with an option to potentially later on, once they're settled, look at changing lifestyle. And I work with a team of guys. One of the gastroenterologists within my practice, he's an expert on some of these biologic drugs, and we tend to employ them for people that are quite severe to get on top of the inflammation early rather than letting the inflammation kick in, and it becomes a vicious cycle sometimes in these severe IBD patients. Yes, but what's been a saviour for me is the fact that I work with accredited dietitians. So I tend not to delve into the personalised nutrition that they require. It's more I approach it from a broad sense of, well, animal source foods are important, quality protein is important, and then we let the dietitians work out the personalised nutrition. So that's been a saviour for me. I'm very grateful for the team that I've built around me to allow me to institute this way of practicing. It's an unbelievable statement, isn't it? That diet has nothing to do with the inflammatory bowel disease. What a cop out from our industry. The sad reality is there's just not enough data, because I mean, where's the money in performing dietary interventions, right? So, but I think diet has everything to do with chronic illness in general, full stop. And I think inflammatory bowel disease, most of all, is a there has to be a dietary trigger. Of course, I acknowledge there's other factors, childhood antibiotic use, the microbiome that you inherit from our mothers, all of that comes into play. And there's no doubt, as a species, our microbiome through every generation is just getting worse. It's becoming less resilient, more pathogenic bacteria. But at its core, I think it's very dynamic. It's still able to change, but it requires you to fight against this processed environment or processed food environment that we exist in, which is an uphill struggle. I think that statement that is thrown around, that diet has nothing to do with inflammatory bowel disease, it's simply lazy. It's what we're taught in medical school, Sean, and I think they're just regurgitating it, not open to new ideas, very drug-centric, and I think that needs to change. We know that even resistance training or exercise changes your microbiome. So all of these factors needs to be taken into consideration and delivered to the patient as a package. And it's really up to them whether they open that package and run with it, right? But we've got to be able to deliver it all. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about our gut can only handle a certain amount of protein load and so forth. I think if it's a processed protein, yes, because it just rushes through this rapid transit into the colon. Once it's in the colon, there's no point. You've got no ability to absorb that protein. It's all up to the bacteria now. And they essentially strip that fuel for themselves. They give you very little in terms of that bargain, as we've discussed earlier. But we've got this reservoir, we've got this capacity to contain things like meat within our stomach and slowly release it into the small bowel. The body regulates that so well and so efficiently. And I think we fail to take that into consideration, that this system, this digestive tract that we've evolved from a fruit-eating ancestor 4 million years ago to where we are now, is finely tuned for animal-sourced foods. It really is. And this is the problem. Evolutionary biology is not something that's taught in med school, is it? It's not a big part of our curriculum. It makes zero part of our curriculum. So we fail to understand these nuances as doctors, and hence we can't really hand out that knowledge to our patients. But the way I try and teach my patients is that we are very, very finely tuned for it. It's just the modern environment, the modern method of eating is just completely out of keeping with evolution, and we have evolutionary mismatch. So in terms to go back to your question about meat, I think we've got great capacity to absorb it. We've just got to eat to satiety. You can almost pick the individuals that will have colonic polyps. They're overweight generally diabetic. Caucasian, being Caucasian is also a risk factor, and being above the age of 50. These are all risk factors for colonic polyps. I think it's been linked to red meat before, but the randomized control trials like the polyp study and the Women's Health Initiative, which is a high quality study, really didn't show that a high fiber diet or a vegetable plant-based diet helped in terms of polyp development, there really wasn't. So it all goes back to hyperinsulinemia, which is of course linked with diabetes and obesity. I think that is the biggest risk factor. Insulin at its core is a growth factor. You could use it to grow your adipocytes, or you could grow your muscles. I mean, bodybuilders utilize their own endogenous insulin to grow. It's just they've got to eat in a way to stimulate that. We've got to remember that it is a growth factor, and I think you've answered the question there, Sean. It is hyperinsulinemia that's the issue at its core. That's a risk factor for these colonic polyps, and we're seeing more and more of these now. Vast majority of illness that we see is just this terrible food environment in which we live with extremely sedentary lifestyles, right? So I have not seen an issue that a good diet and a little bit of resistance training can't correct. So we can become very one-eyed in this space because you think diet fixes everything, but largely speaking, it really doesn't it? With chronic illness, 99% of it will resolve with the right approach.